So, hello and welcome everyone to our weekly session titled Latest in Bitcoin Tech. And what we do here is we go through the Bitcoin Optech newsletter, which is a newsly week letter published that encompasses the latest events that have unfolded in the previous few days in the world of Bitcoin and Lightning and even Nostr. It comprises primarily of a few sections, few regular sections, like there is a news section where they cover the latest news and events that have unfolded in Bitcoin or Lightning or Nostr. And they have a release and release candidate section and a notable code and documentation changes section, which is occasionally uh, accompanied with Bitcoin Stack Exchange Q&A and also at times with PR review clubs. And this week we have the Bitcoin Q&A Stack Exchange. So it's a mammoth newsletter in size. It has one news article, but that comprises of 4 bullet points. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 questions from Bitcoin Stack Exchange. It has one release candidate and I guess four code and documentation updates. We'll see how much of it we can cover in an hour. I will start with reading the preface of the newsletter. This week we'll be covering newsletter number 313, published on 26th of July 2024. This week's newsletter summarizes a wide-ranging discussion about free relay and fee bumping upgrades in Bitcoin Core. Also included are our regular sections sharing popular questions and answers from the Bitcoin Stack Exchange, announcing new releases and release candidates, and describing notable changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure projects. We'll start with the news article, which is bifurcated into 4 parts. I think we can read the entire thing. We'll read half of it and we'll cover it, and then we'll go to the other half. All right. So uh, the heading is varied discussion of free relay and fee bumping upgrades. Peter Todd posted to the Bitcoin Dev mailing list a summary of a free relay attack that he previously responsibly disclosed to Bitcoin Core developers. This led to an entangled discussion of multiple issues and proposed improvements. Some of the topics discussed included free relay attacks. Free relay occurs when a full node relays unconfirmed transactions without the amount of fee revenue in its mempool increasing by at least the minimum relay rate by default, 1 sat per a virtual byte. Free relay often costs some money, so it's not technically free, but the cost is far low what honest users pay. Free relay allows an attacker to greatly increase the bandwidth used by relaying full nodes, which may reduce the number of relay nodes. If the number of independently operated relay nodes drops too low, spenders are essentially sending transactions directly to miners, which has the same centralization risks as out-of-band fees. Todd's described attack exploits differences in mempool policies between miners and users. Many miners appear to enable full RBF, but Bitcoin Core does not enable it by default. See newsletter number 263. This allows an attacker to craft different versions of a transaction, which will be treated differently by full RBF miners and non-full RBF relay nodes. Relay nodes can end up relaying multiple versions of a transaction that have minimal chance of confirming, wasting the bandwidth of the relaying nodes. Free relay attacks do not directly allow attackers to steal other users' funds, although a sudden or prolonged attack may be used to disrupt the network and make other types of attacks easier. To the best of our knowledge, no disruptive free relay attack has ever been performed. The first half of the news article talks about free relays. All right, it's a free relay attack. Recently, some drama happened on Twitter when Peter Todd tweeted saying that he disclosed a vulnerability in Bitcoin Core and to Bitcoin Core's developers who are responsible for mitigating security lapses and vulnerabilities, and his report or his email was overlooked and he did not get any response to it. And then I guess he got a reply from the concerned people, etc. And then he posted the entire incident to a Bitcoin dev mailing list. So the post that these guys are referring to covers that entire thing. We'll not go into what the controversy was. The point being, there was a vulnerability lapse that Peter Todd had detected. Peter Todd basically maintains a parallel implementation of Bitcoin Core. Okay, he maintains a parallel implementation of Bitcoin Core, which is known as liberal relay. And basically, this is an implementation that allows the users to replace by fee rate. Bitcoin Core currently allows you to replace by fee rate and absolute fee. So the fee rate and the absolute fee, meaning the replacing transaction should not only pay a higher fee per sat, it should also per virtual byte, it should also pay a higher absolute fee, meaning it should pay a higher fee than the transaction it is replacing and the cumulative fee of all the ancestors of the transaction in the mempool that it is replacing. All right, so this is like kind of a trivia that a parallel implementation or a fork of Bitcoin Core is separately maintained by Peter Todd. We'll not go into the entire thing. We will just read what concerns us, what this attack is about, how this attack can be pulled off. I'll just read what this attack is. If you're a competent Bitcoin engineer familiar with how mempools work, you've probably figured it out already based on the title. Obviously, if a high percentage of miners are adopting a policy that Bitcoin core nodes are not, you can cheaply consume transaction relay bandwidth by simply relaying transactions that miners are rejecting. Okay, so Peter Todd has raised a concern about the differences in node policies of the miners and the individual nodes, the relaying nodes, right? We have multiple types of nodes. We have different nodes on the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network. That play different roles. So, right, there are mining nodes, okay, which the miners use to curate their candidate block, which they can mine. Okay, and then there are users, right, that use the node to relay information and to send and receive transactions. They don't mine. Okay, so a lot of people are of the opinion that mempool policies should be, or node policies should be replicated. Like the more the number of users that have the same node policies, the better it is. The more uniform and the more structured the peer-to-peer network is, because as a user you can predict what the miner's mempool will look like, and that can help you estimate the fee. This is the claim made by the advocates who claim that it's better to have similar mempool policies, which is the case. It's not a consensus rule. It's like nobody can force you to adopt to a certain mempool policy. It is absolutely arbitrary. As long as you're abiding by the consensus rules, each node runner has the prerogative to decide what mempool policies or node policies or relay policies they want to adopt. However, the more uniform these policies are, the better it is. So this attack or this vulnerability that Peter Todd reported is a consequence, or can be a consequence, of the fact that majority of the nodes are applying a certain mempool policy, whereas majority of the users are applying a certain different mempool policy. What's this policy? This is full RBF, that is enabling RBF by default. Okay, initially we did not have anything called as RBF, right? Then we introduced RBF. What's RBF? Like two competing transactions. If there are two competing transactions with each other, okay, one transaction pays the higher fee, that transaction gets chosen by the miner. All right, so if I broadcast transaction A, and after some time I broadcast transaction B, and transaction B has one or more unconfirmed inputs of transaction A, then these are conflicting transactions. Both of them cannot be mined together. Two transactions, both having the same unconfirmed inputs, cannot be mined together, cannot be included in the block together. One of them has to be dumped out. These are known as conflicting transactions. So how do you as a miner determine which transaction should you mine, and how do you as a user indicate to the miner which transaction you prioritize? Right, miners, most of them are profit maximalists. So if you have broadcasted two transactions, conflicting transactions, both of whom have the same unconfirmed inputs, a way through which you can indicate to the miner which one you want to be confirmed and which one you want to be rejected is the one that pays the higher fee. If you pay the higher fee, the miner obviously will be incentivized to choose that transaction. So the transaction which pays the higher fee replaces the initial transaction. This is known as replace by fee. This was opt-in. Okay, there's a BIP 125 which proposes the rules for RBF. You can go through it. This was an opt-in mechanism. So if you broadcasted a transaction and you wanted that transaction to be replaced by another transaction for any reason in the future, that transaction, that initial transaction had to signal RBF. All right. So when you broadcast transaction A and you think that you might have to replace that transaction A with transaction B in the future, you signal for it. When you're broadcasting transaction A, you signal that this transaction is RBF. Like this can be RBF. Only if you signal while broadcasting transaction A can it be replaced by transaction B. If you have not signaled, then it will not be replaced by the other transaction. The first node across which that transaction comes, it will reject it, because one node will never relay the same unconfirmed transaction with the same unconfirmed input twice. So if you have not signaled for RBF, you cannot replace that transaction. Then we moved on to the second stage, where we have this thing called, the first stage was opt-in RBF. The second stage is full RBF. What is full RBF? Full RBF means you have a configuration. You can configure your node to either switch on RBF by default or switch it off. So you have two options. The first option is by default full RBF is switched on. Okay, so none of your transactions can be replaced except if you signal for it. But as a node runner, you can customize your node configurations, right? We have a config file. We have a bitcoin.conf file in our node. All of you who are running your nodes know that there is a bitcoin.conf file where you can go and you can customize a lot of things. Like you can choose what network you want to work on, whether it's testnet, whether it's a edge test, whether you want a prune node, whether you don't want a prune node, how much data do you want to put in operator, and lots of configurations. So you can go there and you can switch it on. So if you switch it on, by default in Bitcoin Core it's off. By default in Bitcoin Core it's off, but you can go and switch it on. So if you switch it on, what will happen is that you don't have to signal for RBF. All your transactions by default are eligible for RBF. This is the policy that most of the miners use, right? Because RBF is something that incentivizes the miner profits. So all the nodes that the miners are running, 90% of the nodes, as per a test conducted by a handful of developers, more than 90% of the miners, relevant miners on the network, have full RBF enabled by default. So I guess these people made 120 transactions and tried to replace them by default, and they figured out that 118 of them got replaced. So they like inferred that majority of the miners on the network are using full RBF. However, majority of the nodes that are using majority of the nodes of the network, non-mining nodes on the network, are not using full RBF. So majority of the miners are using full RBF, but majority of the nodes users, non-mining nodes, are not using full RBF. Now, where can this cause an issue? This can cause an issue, and how it can cause an issue we'll discuss here. So up till now, I hope it is clear. We know what is RBF. All right, we know what are conflicting transactions, we know what is opt-in RBF, we know what is full RBF by default. All right, I hope I've covered this much up till now, and what is the importance or the significance of having a uniform mempool across the P2P network. It's not mandatory, but the more uniform it is, the better it is. So how can this be exploited? How can ununiform mempool policies between miners and nodes be exploited? Here's a scenario. Broadcast a small low fee rate transaction A with BIP 125 opt-in disabled. All right. So somebody, let's say, broadcasts a transaction A with a low fee rate. Okay. And that transaction A cannot be RBF'd. Okay. So you are not signaling for it. It cannot be RBF'd. You broadcast a transaction A which has a low fee rate. It cannot be RBF'd. Broadcast a full RBF double spend of A2 with a higher fee rate. So you take the unconfirmed inputs of transaction A and you create another transaction A2. A2 can have one or more unconfirmed inputs of A. It means A and A2 are conflicting transactions. Both of them cannot be mined together. Either A will be mined or A2 will be mined, because they are conflicting transactions. The difference is A cannot be RBF'd, but A2 can be RBF'd, and A is a low fee rate transaction while A2 is a higher fee rate transaction. It's obvious that the miners will give preference to which one? The high fee rate transaction. Spend the outputs of A in a large low fee rate transaction B with BIP 125. So now A we broadcasted, and we'll add a child to A, which is named B. Now this child is a low fee rate transaction again. So what will happen? There will be some nodes on the network that will see A first. Okay. And when these nodes will see A first, and let's say that these nodes do not have RBF enabled by default, and then later on they see A2, what will happen? They'll reject A2, right? Because the nodes that do not have RBF enabled, they will not replace a transaction. So if they see a transaction A which is low in fee, they'll broadcast it. Then they'll see a conflicting transaction A2, they will not broadcast it. But those nodes which have full RBF enabled by default, they will broadcast both the transactions. They'll broadcast transaction A, then they'll see transaction A2, and they'll broadcast transaction A2, because transaction A2 will replace. So half the nodes, let's say there's a 50-50% scenario, half the nodes on the network will see transaction A broadcasted, then they'll see transaction A2, they'll reject it. And the other half of the nodes will see transaction A, they'll broadcast it, and then they'll see transaction A2 and they'll broadcast it as well. They'll replace A with A2. And then with to A, we know A is never going to get mined because A pays a low fee rate and A2 is going to pay a high fee rate. So what is going to be the catch here? The catch here is going to be all the nodes on the network that do not have full RBF enabled by default will relay A for no rhyme or reason. They'll just end up wasting their bandwidth, because we know eventually it's the miners are always going to select A2, because the miners have full RBF enabled by default. They'll see A, then they'll see A2, they'll see both these are conflicting transactions, they'll realize they can only choose one of the two, they'll see A2 has a higher fee, so they are obviously going to select A2. Now, those nodes on the network that do not support RBF will broadcast transaction A for no rhyme or reason. They'll end up wasting their bandwidth. Okay. If you're not running a node to broadcast a transaction, it consumes internet, right? It consumes internet, it consumes electricity. You have to run your node, right? So you are basically wasting a lot of bandwidth, right? And it's not only one single node. If there are 50,000 nodes on the network and 40,000 of them do not have RBF enabled, then 40,000 nodes will relay this transaction again and again and again. All 40,000 of those nodes will relay this transaction. And we know very well that this transaction will never get mined. So this will just end up wasting the common resources of the network. This will just end up wasting the bandwidth of the network. Now, what is being done is that it is not limited to that. We'll add a child B to A. We'll add a child B to A, knowing that it's an attack, okay? Knowing that A will never get mined, we'll add a child B, which also pays a low fee rate. And this child B will signal BIP 125. It will signal replaceability, okay? So what we'll do is we'll add a child B to it. Now B is replaceable. Okay, so we'll constantly keep on replacing B. So first we wasted the bandwidth by broadcasting A, knowing very well that A cannot be replaced, but the transactions that do not support, but the nodes that do not support RBF will keep on broadcasting A and waste their bandwidth. We've not stopped there. We've added another child to A, which is B, and this child signals for BIP 125. So the child can be replaced. So we'll further waste the bandwidth of the nodes by doing what? By replacing B. We can't replace A, but we can replace B. So we'll keep on replacing B. All right, we'll keep on replacing B by a minuscule amount. Let's say 1 sats per virtual byte. Right, we'll just keep on increasing the fee by 1 sat per virtual byte, 1 sat per virtual byte, and the nodes will keep on relaying like different versions of B prime, B double prime, B triple prime, like that. So what this attack does is that the attacker knows that A2 is the transaction that will be included in the block. For reason A, majority of the miners support full RBF by default, and A2 is a full RBF transaction. And the second reason, A2 pays a higher fee. Okay, so we know very well that A2 is going to get mined. Despite that, we will broadcast A1 to waste the bandwidth of those nodes that do not support full RBF by default, and we'll add a child to it which signals BIP 125, and then keep on replacing that child, increase that child's fee to a minuscule value to further waste the bandwidth and resources of the nodes by relaying B and then relaying B prime and then relaying B double prime. And we can do that, we can keep on doing that till the cumulative fee of A and B is not greater than A2. So the fee rate as well as the cumulative or the absolute fee of A and B is not greater than A2. Till that, we can make the nodes relay A and B for no rhyme or reason and thereby wasting their nodes. So this is an attack that Peter Todd brought to the attention of Bitcoin code developers. This is a vulnerability, and I personally I'm not sure how this vulnerability is solvable, at least in Bitcoin Core as of now. I don't think this vulnerability can be mitigated as of now, except if majority of the mining nodes and the user nodes decide to start using full replace by fee by default. Because what happens is most people who are running their nodes, they don't many of them are not competent enough to understand what parameters or what configuration their node comprises of, right? I have seen a lot of people who are running nodes, but they don't understand what software is being run on their nodes, what new features are available on their nodes, what version they're running, what client they are running, whether they verified the signatures or no. And many of them don't even understand how to change parameters, how to manipulate the not manipulate but how to customize the parameters, the configurations to your own use cases. And that is why whenever a feature in Bitcoin Core is off by default, you'll find 99% of people keeping it off. And whenever it's on by default, you'll see 99% of people keeping it on by default. So as of now, Bitcoin Core has full RBF off by default, but the miners, majority of the miners have on by default. So that is the reason why this attack is possible. And the only mitigation that I see of this attack is a situation or a scenario where both the miners and the users decide to keep full RBF on by default. Like, nobody can force you to do that. If you want to keep it off, you can. It's your node, you're absolutely autonomous. But to mitigate this vulnerability, the ideal scenario would be that day when all the nodes, non-mining nodes and the mining nodes, both decide to keep full RBF on by default. In that situation, A will get replaced by A to N. There'll be no possibility to attach B to A, because A will get rejected. All right. So that is what this attack is about. This is a long article. First, Peter Todd expresses his discontent over the fact that his email was overlooked and not replied by. And then again, I think he goes on to explain this in much more detail. And I think he also, I'm not sure, is happy with the V3 transactions, which is also, I believe, I'm not very certain, I believe is also the opinion of Peter Vola, who's not a big fan of V3 transactions, but I'm not very sure about it. So the point being, this is what the vulnerability is that is being talked about. And to summarize, this vulnerability happens or can be exploited because of the fact that the non-mining nodes and the mining nodes can have different node policies. So majority of the mining nodes have full RBF enabled by default. Majority of the users, non-mining nodes, have full RBF disabled by default, which can be exploited by an attacker to waste common resources and the bandwidth of the network. How can that be done? We discussed. Here are the 5 steps that I mentioned, and we discussed how that is possible. All right, I'll just read out this thing maybe up till here, because that is what it is, and then we'll open it up for questions before we proceed forward. Free relay and replace by fee rate. Peter Todd had previously proposed 2 forms of replace by fee rate. The newsletter number 288. One criticism of RBFR was that it enabled free relay. A similar amount of free relay is already possible through the attack he described this week and similar attacks. So he argued that concerns about free relay should not block adding a feature useful for mitigating transaction pinning attacks. One reply argued that free relay created by RBFR was fundamental to its design, but other free relay problems in the design of Bitcoin Core might be solvable. So basically, Peter Todd has also like Peter Todd, I believe, is the father of free replace by fee. Okay, he's the one who introduced, or at least he's the one who was the who's the catalyst in introducing replace by fee in Bitcoin Core. Now he has, what happens in Bitcoin Core is basically, when you relay a transaction, okay, and you want to replace it with another transaction, there is a fee you have to pay. All right, because when every node is relaying 2 conflicting transactions by you, every node is investing twice the amount of bandwidth it would have, right? So if you broadcast transaction A, all the nodes in the network will further broadcast and gossip that transaction. Then you replace that transaction with another conflicting transaction, so all the nodes for the second time have to relay that same transaction. So you are wasting common resources, you are wasting bandwidth of the network, and you have to compensate for that, right? Because nodes are paying for their bandwidth, nodes are paying for the electricity, so you have to compensate for it. How do you compensate for it? There has to be like a mechanism to prevent this. Otherwise, if you allow people to replace transactions for free, then anybody can easily pull off what is known as a free relay attack. What's a free relay attack? I broadcast a transaction A, I replace that transaction with transaction A prime, then I replace it with transaction A double prime, then I replace it with transaction A triple prime. I can replace one transaction 1,000 times. All right, and if there are 1,000 users who replace their transactions 1,000 times, then the entire network will get clogged, right? The entire network will get clogged, because there is only a limit to the amount of messages that the peers can gossip. And if you clog the network with irrelevant, unwanted spam messages, then it depreciates the performance of the network exponentially. It might even lead to nodes crashing. That is why, to prevent that, this free relay attack, Bitcoin Core has a condition, a prerequisite. I don't have the code base open right now, else so we would have gone into it. I guess you'll find it in policy.h. If you go to your Bitcoin Core node, you'll find it in policy.h that every time you relay a transaction, you want to replace it with another transaction, the minimum extra fee that you have to pay is 1 sat per virtual byte. So if I broadcast a transaction A, after that I want to replace it with transaction B should pay at least 1 sat per virtual byte extra as compared to transaction A. So if transaction A was paying 3 sats per virtual byte, transaction B has to pay at least 4 sats per virtual byte. Only then the nodes will relay it, otherwise it will not. This is to impose a cost on somebody who's trying to replace a transaction, because if you don't impose this cost, then people will, for no rhyme or reason, keep on broadcasting the same transaction and keep on conflicting it and wasting bandwidth. So I believe Peter Todd's implementation that he maintains does not have that prerequisite. You can go and confirm. Don't take my word on it. I haven't gone through the code base of Liberal Relay that he maintains, but I believe that is the case. All right, that is my overview understanding. I might be incorrect. And however, what he says is that he can fix it. Like he calls this thing known as one-shot replace by fee. All right, what he says is that we don't want this 1 sat per virtual byte rule. All right, you can replace one transaction by the other transaction only based on the fee rate. You don't have to look at the absolute fee, because we discussed at the advent of the session that for one transaction to replace the other, the replacement transaction needs to not only pay a higher fee rate, not only pay a higher fee per sat per virtual byte, it also has to pay an absolute higher fee. So it should pay a higher cumulative fee than the transaction that is trying to replace along with all of its ancestors. What Peter Tosh suggests is that we don't have to do that. Okay, as long as transaction B, which is trying to replace transaction A, pays a higher fee rate than transaction A, it's good to replace. But the other impediment or caveat that we can apply and we should apply is that the replacing transaction must pay a fee which ensures us that it will get confirmed in the next 2 blocks. All right. So this prevents a free relay attack. All right. So because somebody can broadcast a transaction with a very low fee, then replace it with another very low fee transaction, then replace it with another very low fee transaction, then replace it with another very low fee transaction. Right. So at let's say currently the estimated fee is 15 sats per virtual byte. So somebody can broadcast a transaction with 4 sats per virtual byte, then replace it with 5, then with 6, then with 7, then with 8, then with 9, 10, 11. Okay, and keep on replacing these transactions and end up wasting the cumulative bandwidth of the network. To prevent that, what we will do is, once you've broadcasted a transaction, if you want to replace it, you can replace it merely based on the fee rate, overlooking the absolute fee. But the condition is that the fee rate that you're paying for the second transaction, which is trying to replace the first transaction, should be so much that our fee rate estimator should ensure that this transaction will get confirmed in the next 1 or 2 blocks. So in this situation, what will happen is that we'll prevent a free relay attack. This is known as one-shot free relay. So if anywhere you read one-shot free relay, you know what it is now. It's a proposal by Peter Todd that allows one transaction to replace the other transaction merely based on the absolute fee, overlooking the merely based on the fee rate, overlooking the absolute fee, but the replacement transaction should pay a fee which is as high to ensure that it gets confirmed in the next 1 or 2 blocks to mitigate free relay attacks. So this is what we had to discuss about free relays. I think we've talked about it in very much detail. If any questions, any thing to share or say, please go ahead. I'll pause for now.
How do you ensure that the fee rate is high enough that it gets in the blockchain in the next 2 blocks? There's no way to ensure that, right? There's no objective number to that.
Yeah, but I mean, like your wallet gives you an estimate, right? I mean, if you go to mempool.space, you must have 100%. Everybody has seen that low priority X fee,
Yes.
medium priority Y fee, right? So what Bitcoin Core does is that when you are creating a transaction, Bitcoin Core asks you in how many blocks do you want this transaction to get confirmed. You can put a parameter. Like, none of us create our own transactions. That used to happen in the early days. Now we use sophisticated wallets that do that for us. But your wallet might ask you whether this transaction is medium priority, it's high priority, it's low priority. Okay, based on that, your wallet will give a value. Okay, if you say high priority, then your wallet will choose 1. two, which means this transaction should be confirmed in one block or two block, right? So your wallet will estimate the fee that, okay, to get this transaction confirmed in the next one or two blocks, this is a high transaction, high priority transaction, so I need to get this confirmed in the next one or two blocks. So it will estimate the fee. It look at the blockchain and see that recently how many transactions which are looking similar to my transaction got confirmed in one or two blocks, and how much fee did they
Is it
pay. So from
going to be a consensus rule, right? It's always going to be a policy rule. Mostly, like if someone is selecting a replace by fee transaction, which they are marking to be confirmed in next two blocks and paying the commensurate fees, then we take it in the mempool. Something like that.
No, you can take it. It's I mean, there is no guarantee. Your wallet is estimating that, hey, you want this transaction to get confirmed in the next two blocks. My guess is that if you pay X amount of fee, I'm looking at the blockchain, and after looking at the blockchain, after analyzing the data, after seeing the other transactions that got confirmed in two blocks, I believe that your transaction will get confirmed in the next two blocks if you pay X amount of fee, and then your wallet shoots that transaction. There's absolutely no guarantee that it'll confirm. It'll 100% get confirmed in the next two blocks. It is just an estimation that your wallet will make.
Me conocen, yo soy
Got
Bren,
it.
hay,
There's a
hay un
question from
poquito
Coding
de
P110,
todo lo que
which
está
is
haciendo
about
en
like why RBF isn't on by default. And
Can everybody please mute yourself who are not speaking other than Saurav? I think Oxford, can you please mute yourself? There's some disturbance. All right, I'll read coding piece question. Was curious about why full RBF isn't on by default. Can this cause an issue to a normal user? Why is full RBF?
So the answer is there are a lot of older transactions. I don't know if there are, but the theory is there were older transactions which were broadcasted to Bitcoin blockchain in the hope that someday they will be confirmed, irrespective of their low fees. Now, if full RBF is on, the person who had made those transactions, they can cheat the receivers. They can broadcast a new transaction with a higher fees, and yeah, they can cheat the receivers. Receivers, though they might not have received the Bitcoin now, they are sure that someday those transactions will come to their way. I think that is the reason, probably.
Right, that could be one of the reasons. Dhruval says due to legacy transactions in previous days, merchants were providing the service even though the transactions is unconfirmed, assuming it will be always mined in future. Full RBF has been introduced later, so this was causing issues to merchants. All right. This might be a case, but I'm not really sure how many such transactions do we have. I'm sure there are not hundreds or millions of transactions. So generally, whenever a new feature is enabled in Bitcoin Core or basically in any software, it gets implemented in stages. All right, we've been talking about v3 transactions a lot recently, and we even did a PR review recently where we were talking about v3 transactions. V3 transactions are currently considered to be standard by Bitcoin Core, meaning your Bitcoin Core wallet will consider transactions that have version number 3 as standard. Up till now, it was only considering transactions with version numbers 1 and 2 standard. Now it also considers transactions with version number 3 as standard, but it will not allow you to create. It'll only relay. So generally when changes happen in any software, they happen gradually. Okay, so initially we did not have an RBF, then we had an opt-in RBF, then we had a default of, now we have a default of RBF. I think the next stage would be default on RBF. So I personally believe, I'm not aware of, I don't have statistics in front of me. Like this reason pointed out by Saurav and Dhruval is very valid, but like I don't have any statistics to see like how many such transactions there actually are. If there are not a lot of transactions, then I don't think this will be taken into consideration. And full RBF, I won't be surprised if full RBF is on by default in the upcoming updates of Bitcoin Core, not the recent one, but in the near future. I think that will be next. Right, after full RBF, the opt-in.
So it might take some time for it to be on by default. That's what my hunch is. Yeah.
Right. I believe that would be the case. If a transaction is submitted with very low fees, say 1 sat per virtual byte, till when will the nodes keep this transaction in mempool? As for 1 sats per virtual byte, it will It will not even get relayed. One sat, it will not even get relayed. 3 sats per virtual byte is minimum. That's the hard-coded value in Bitcoin Core. But your okay, so for how long will it be kept in the mempool? I don't know the exact time span, but it'll be kept. I mean, your mempool has finite space, right? Like like some time ago I was running a node on a package software where I could actually see what the size of my mempool was, and you can also choose it. So it was 300 MB, right? So if that transaction fits into your mempool, your mempool is empty, and your transaction fits into your mempool, it'll stay in your mempool. And once you have a transaction which pays a higher fee than that transaction, then it will be kicked off. I personally am not aware, not very certain that there is a time frame that after X amount of time the transaction gets kicked out of your mempool. If your mempool is empty, that transaction will stay there until and unless a transaction with higher fee comes up and there's no space in your mempool, and then it gets kicked out.
Also, just
But I would also
FYI,
like
right now the transaction fees are super low, like 1 sat per virtual byte. Yesterday it was as low as 1 sat per virtual byte, 2 sats per virtual byte. So if in case you are looking to have those kind of transactions, this might be a good time.
right. Cool. Todd's this. All right. So yeah, we've discussed about free relay. Now truck transactions. I personally was in favor of looking into the Bitcoin like Q&A. Okay, because I believe covering truck transactions will take some time. We'll have to go through what truck transactions are, what cluster mempool is, what CPFP carve out is, what anchor outputs are, what package relay is, and that leads up the entire session. And instead of that, if we cover the question answer session, maybe we can in the next 15-20 minutes we can cover a lot of questions and talk about a lot of different and interesting topics instead of just spending the entire second half of the session on talking about one thing. So like, what do y'all think? Let's move on to the Q&A section. That'll be okay, right? We can extend the session till 9:15. Yeah.
I'm good otherwise. For me, it's
All right, fine. Okay, what about that joke now? Did anybody get that joke? Go to the if y'all are on phone or y'all are on computer, go to the general thread, okay, and look at the message that I posted just now. Okay, it has a text. Now see if you can make out infer what the joke is from that text, because now we understand what free relay is, what replace by fee is. If anybody can make out what the joke intends, even if it's the most shabby interpretation, just try and come up with what y'all can come up with. The two children are born one after the other. Hey, Bitcoiners are boring people, and nobody gets the joke. Okay, 10 more seconds I'll wait. If nobody replies, then I'll. Okay, 10 seconds got. Nobody got the joke. All right. So the message that I posted, basically this is op return. Okay, in your transaction, you have this opcode called op return, which can encompass 83 bytes of data, depending upon what client you're using and what configuration you have. I think in Bitcoin Core, it is 83 bytes. Some other clients have 42 bytes. You can configure it. Okay, so somebody has put this transaction in his op return. I think they gave birth to a twins. All right, so they wanted to put it in the blockchain, so they put it in op return. So most of us know that in the Genesis block, Satoshi also put this piece of text, right? The chancellor on the brink of bailout, he put it in the op return. Somebody's put this on op return so that this should be on the blockchain forever, that they gave birth to twins, all right? And just now I mentioned that this liberal relay, which is a fork of Bitcoin Core maintained by Peter Todd, all right? Now what this does is that this allows you to replace by fee rate. Okay, what is replaced by fee rate? If transaction B is replacing transaction A, transaction B needs to pay a higher fee per virtual byte, all right? Not a higher absolute fee, just a higher fee per virtual byte. So the joke basically is that when the first child was born, you can send a first transaction with an op return saying that, hey, my child was born. Okay. After a few seconds, the second child was born. So what do? You just broadcast another transaction saying that it's twins, right? And that second transaction will replace the first transaction and get mined in the blockchain. So instead of sending two different transactions, you can send one transaction using Libra Relay, and then the doctor tells you, hey, the second child is also born. So you replace the first transaction by the second transaction and inform the world that, hey, it's twins, it's not just one child. So it was kind of a joke that if somebody's using liberal relay, then they get a twins. So the first child, you post about the first child in broadcast transaction 1, then the second child is born, you post about it in transaction 2, and the second child's message replaces the first message, and then this gets mined on the blockchain, which is not possible if you're using Bitcoin Core and you have not signaled for RBF. But if you're using Libra Relay, which is a fork maintained by Peter Todd, then you can do that. So that's what the joke was. So now hopefully you all get the joke, because I was going through the comment section and nobody got the joke.
This is interesting, Fazal, but why is it that on Bitcoin Core this is not possible and on Liberal Relay this is possible? On Bitcoin Core also I can say RBF, opt-in RBF transaction and then broadcast the second transaction with the other opt-in message, no?
Right. So what Bitcoin Core says is that there are 5 or 6 rules for RBF. 2 of them we'll talk about. One rule is that let's say transaction A is broadcasted that first child is born. Transaction B is broadcasted that twins are born. Okay. Now, if transaction B wants to replace transaction A, transaction B has to pay a higher fee rate. What is a higher fee rate? High fee per virtual byte. So if transaction A is paying 3 sats per virtual byte, transaction A is paying 3 sats per virtual byte, transaction B has to pay 4 sats per virtual byte. All right, this is the first condition. This is common to both Liberal Relay and to Bitcoin Core. But Bitcoin Core adds one more condition. What does Bitcoin Core say? Bitcoin Core says transaction B has to pay a higher absolute fee than transaction A. Okay, so let's say transaction A is of 100 bytes in size and it's paying 3 sats per byte. So it's paying a total fee of 300 sats, right? Now transaction A, let's say, is 50 bytes in size and it's paying a fee of 4 sats per virtual byte. So it's paying how much? 200, right? So even though transaction B is paying 4 sats per virtual byte and transaction A is paying 3 sats per virtual byte, despite that, transaction A is paying a higher total fee because it is 100 bytes in size. So 3 into 100 is 300. And even though transaction B is paying a higher fee per virtual byte, 4 sats per virtual byte, but because its size is small, it's 50 bytes, it's only paying a total 200 bytes. So the miners will see two transactions. One is paying 300 sats and the other is paying 200 sats. So even though the first transaction is paying a lower fee rate, but it's paying a higher total fee. And the transaction B, even though it's paying a higher fee rate, but it's paying a lower total fee. So Bitcoin Core says that not only the fee rate, but the cumulative fee also should be greater for transaction B to replace transaction A. But Peter Todd's implementation says no, only if the fee rate is greater, then the transaction will replace the absolute fee, should not be taken into consideration. And that's how his implementation behaves. So this transaction will not go through in Core, it will go through in Liberal Relay.
Got it.
Did you get it? All right. Yeah. So yeah. All right. We have how much? 15, 10, 20, 25 minutes. All right. We'll go through questions. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions. We'll see how many we can cover. We'll try and cover at least 5. Give 5 minutes to each. There's a surprise in today's Bitcoin Stack exchange Q&A as well. All right. The second question is very special. The first question says, why is restructure for mempool required with cluster mempool? Okay, we've been talking about this a lot. They are planning to overhaul the mempool. Currently, what happens is that we even discussed this last week. So those of you who were present last week, I think we even looked into the code base. We talked in detail about linearization of cluster mempools proposed by Peter Todd. So in brief, what happens currently is that a transaction in the mempool of Bitcoin Core currently is arranged in the form of ascendants and descendants. All right. So any unconfirmed transaction in the mempool cannot have more than 24 unconfirmed ascendants, and it cannot have more than 24 unconfirmed descendants. Okay, and it cannot have ascendants, unconfirmed descendants with a weight of more than I guess 101 kilo virtual bytes, and it cannot have descendants, unconfirmed descendants more than 101 virtual kilobytes. All right. So if there is a transaction in the mempool, okay, and let's say it has 24 unconfirmed descendants, meaning it has a child, it has a grandchild, is a great grandchild, great grandchild. All right, it has 24 descendants to it, all of which are unconfirmed in the mempool, and then the 25th fellow tries to come, 25th fellow cannot come. All right, so this is how the transactions are arranged. And how do we decide which transactions are to be included into the mempool? We decide that based on the highest ancestor fee rate. All right, so if 2 transactions are competing to get in the mempool, okay, we will see that which transactions ancestral fee is highest, all right? Which transactions parent, grandparent, great grandparent, etc., can give us the highest fee. And the transaction whose ancestral fee is the highest, we choose that. Okay, so Bitcoin Core, just like we talked about, Bitcoin Core will only let you replace transaction A with transaction B when transaction B is paying a fee which is not only greater than transaction A but also greater than all of its unconfirmed ascendants, right? Only then will it be allowed to be replaced in the mempool. So this is how it works. And when we want to kick out the transactions, how do we kick out? We kick them out based on the descendant fee rate. So if your mempool is full and if one transaction wants to get in, you will have to remove another transaction to put this transaction in, right? So how do you decide which transaction you want to kick out? That is decided based on the descendant fee. So the transaction which pays the lowest descendant fee will get kicked out, all right? So if anybody asks you on what criteria are transactions included or kicked out of the mempool in Bitcoin Core, then we know that transactions are included on the basis of the highest ancestral fee rate. That transaction whose ancestors, unconfirmed ancestors, pay the highest fee gets a preference in entering the mempool, and while kicking out, that transaction whose unconfirmed descendants pay the lowest fee get kicked out. Okay, now this has discrepancies. Like, okay, so if you're in a math node, there are articles that we find on delving Bitcoin in which they've talked about it, that this has discrepancies, right? Because generally your mechanism to allow something to enter the mempool should be exactly opposite of your mechanism to kick out something from the mempool, right? If you have a policy A that decides that a transaction is eligible to enter the mempool, then you should have a policy of complement A, exactly opposite of A, to decide which transaction goes out. All right, so your entering policy should be exact opposite of your rejecting policy, but mathematically it's been proven that there are discrepancies. Every single time a transaction that is included in the mempool is not always the most fee intensive transaction, and every single time when a transaction is kicked out, it is found out that it is always not the least profitable transaction. There are discrepancies in this mechanism that is used in Bitcoin Core currently. Secondly, the Bitcoin Core developers are planning to overhaul the mempool. They're trying to completely abolish this ascendant and descendant limit. So I believe if you go to policy.h file, you'll find these limits: ascendant limit 25, descendant limit 25. They're trying to abolish that, and they're trying to build what they are calling cluster mempool, where transactions will not be bifurcated on the basis of their ancestry or their descendancy. Rather, they will be bifurcated in the form of a cluster. So all transactions that are connected to each other, okay, whether they're ancestors, whether they're descendants, whether they're siblings, if they are anyhow connected to each other, they will be converted into a cluster. They will all be converted into a cluster. Okay, a cluster is a data structure basically, and that cluster will have a upper threshold that a cluster cannot be more than X amount in size. Okay, and then those transactions among the cluster which cannot be relayed individually. Let's say there's a parent that has a very low fee, and then there's a child that's paying a very high fee for that parent. So the parent cannot be relayed or mined on its own because it's paying a very low fee, and the child is paying a high fee. All right. So such transactions which need to be clubbed together in order to be relayed and mined, they'll be known as chunks. Okay. So from ancestors and descendants, we'll go to clusters, where all transactions that are related to each other will be converted into one cluster, and in cluster we'll have chunks, where we'll have couplets of transactions that absolutely rely on each other for getting broadcasted in mind. Okay, so from ancestors and descendants, we'll go to clusters and chunks, and we've talked about this in detail in the preceding sessions. Why is this needed? So I think they've given the answer. You can go through the answer. It's a very detailed answer. But the reason that they've mentioned is the same, that there is discrepancy in ascendant and descendant limits. So with ascendant and descendant anatomy of fee estimation that is currently being deployed in Bitcoin Core, there have been discrepancies that have been mathematically found that this is not the most fee optimizing manner, and cluster mempools optimize the minor fee more than the ascendant descendant limits, and that is why they're switching to cluster mempool. So the questioner asks, why is restructure of mempool required? Okay, so that is the answer. I just answered it. If you have time, then you can go through this. It's a very detailed answer, so we won't have time to read through it entirely. Okay, but that is the gist of it. To incentivize. Sorry, I always goof up between intensive and incentive. To incentivize miners more. Okay, that is the first question. And like I said, there's a second question that's special. Can anybody tell me what is so special about this question?
I
Who
think the
is there?
default value is 125. So I do not know this question. Like, this question is asking whether that is 125 or 130. As much I know, The default peer connection is 125.
Right. Okay. Let's see what's so special about this question. No prizes for you all. You all know who this guy is?
So, this is your question.
I posted this question at Bitshala's Discord as well. Okay. I was preparing for the Optech newsletter a couple of weeks ago, and I came across this question, and the wording was pretty ambiguous in the text. So I posted this question in Bitshala's Discord as well, and then I asked this question to John Attack, who's like one of the former Bitcoin Core maintainers, and currently he's a BIP editor as well and Bitcoin Core contributor. I asked this question to him as well, and he answered me, and he answered here as well. He answered it for me in personal chat as well, and then I posted here as well. And later on, I posted here and I forgot it because I got the answer from John Attack on Twitter. So I didn't look like I did not come back here and see if somebody answered, but I got to see that David Harding replied. David Harding is basically, I believe he's the curator. He's the one who curates the Bitcoin Optech letter.
He's also the co-author
Alright.
of Mastering Bitcoin.
Yes, I think Mastering Bitcoin.
Yes. So
Oh,
it's
alright.
Andreas Antopoulos is the writer, and the third edition is co-written by David Harding.
All right, no wonder, because when I went to their GitHub repository, there were a few errors in the book that I found, and I created a pull request, and I saw that this guy is the one who's almost always replying to the PRs. So I was wondering more what connection he has with mastering Bitcoin. So now I know he's a co-author. All right. Yeah. So basically, there are 125 connections. Okay, but you can increase them by you can add up 8 more connections. Okay, which you can manually add. You can manually choose 8 outbound connections, and you can also choose a couple of feeler connections. Okay, so David Harding says that when I wrote about 130 in the newsletter, I was uncertain whether 125 was the limit for inbound connections or all connections, including block relay only peers. I didn't think the difference between 125 and 135 was significant in relation to attacks, so I settled on about 130. So I asked this question. I said that, hey, the default max peer connections is set to 125 by default in code to the best of my knowledge. However, I read in the Optech newsletter number 310 and that is 130. I could not validate this info anywhere in the code base or the internet. If anyone knows where they deduce this figure of 130 from, kindly let me know. So I was confused because it said about 130 connections. Okay. And because it's a hard coded value, I personally think that mentioning about is incorrect. Okay, because it's a hard coded value, it's exactly 125. So you should mention that 125 connections exactly. And then you can mention that you can further add 8 more outbound connections manually, and you can add a couple of feeler connections. That's fine. But because when you have a hard coded value, then saying about 130 connections can be ambiguous. All right. So I still stand on my question. And he said that he was uncertain about 125 or 135. So he settled for 130. All right. So yeah, I got an answer from John Attack and Light and David Harding as well. That is what it is. Default max peer connections are 125. Okay. In Bitcoin Core, currently you have 8 by default outbound connections, which are full relay, and 2 outbound connections, which are block only relay. And after that, once you exhaust these 125, or even if you don't exhaust these 125, you can add 8 more outbound connections manually and a couple of feeler connections. So that is about 130, but hard coded is 125. So yeah, that was the question. Which one should we take? I'll take the least amount of time. I think we can take a couple of more because it's 9:01. So by 9:10, let's wind up. And then if you have questions, we can give 5 minutes to the questions. Why do protocol developers work on maximizing miner revenue? Okay, let's see this answer. Why do protocol developers work on maximizing miner revenue? Why are so many protocol engineers so worried about miner revenue? So answer is it's extremely useful to multiple different classes of Bitcoin users to be able to predict which transactions miners will include in their blocks. If we assume that miners will attempt to maximize fee revenue, and if we know what algorithms they will use, we can predict their behavior. Just now we discussed that if we have a uniform P2P network, all right, if most of the nodes on the network have similar relay policies, similar mempool policies, similar node policies, it becomes easier for the nodes to communicate with each other. And that is one of the reasons that I believe developers often give a lot of credit or a lot of weightage to the policies that the miners are using, because they want the node runners, the non-mining node runners, to emulate the policies of the nodes, so that it is ensured that their transactions get mined by the miners, because eventually it's the miners that are going to mine your transactions. So it's always better to have a mempool that looks similar to the mempool of the miner, because if your mempool looks completely different to the mempool of the miner who you are expecting to mine your block, there is a very high possibility that you might not end up getting your transaction mined, because you don't know what the miner's mempool looks like, right? There are very few mining pools. There's only one, to the best of my knowledge, that exactly shows you how their mempool is looking like. Okay, that's ocean mining. To the best of my knowledge, other miners do not show you how their mempools look like. It's confidential data. They don't even show to their own miners what blocks they are mining on. It's only Ocean that beforehand tells you that, hey, we have 4 job templates and this is what the candidate block is going to look like. This is block A that we're working on. This is block B that we're working on. This is block C that we're working on. This is block D that we were working on. So you can look at these transactions. If you want to mine with us, mine with us. If you don't like any of our candidate blocks, go and mine with others. To the best of my knowledge, other mining pools don't share their candidate blocks, let alone with the users, but also with the miners. So because you can't see your miners mining pool if your mempool. So if your mempool is drastically different than your miners mempool, then it is possible that you might estimate that your transaction will get confirmed, but it might not get confirmed, right? So, and we saw an example of that, one which Peter Todd posted, that how a vulnerability can be exploited because the miner and the non-mining nodes have different mempool policies, right? This is better. This is working towards a healthy P2P network. Having said that, the disclaimer is that nobody can force you. Nobody can force you to have a node policy that emulates the node policies of the miners. Nobody can force you to have a mempool policy that emulates the mempool policies of the miners, and nobody can force you to have relay policies that emulates the relay policies of the miners. All right, consensus rules are absolutely non-negotiable. They are non-flexible. Okay, so you have no choice. You cannot customize the consensus rules. But as far as policies are concerned, then they're customizable. All right. So if your use case, your vision of Bitcoin entices you to use policies, node policies, or mempool policies, or relay policies that do not resonate with the mempool or node or relay policies of the miners, you are absolutely entitled to choose your own mempool and node policies, right? Ideally, we'd like to live in a world where almost everybody that's running a node has the same mempool, has the same relay policies, has the same node policies. But that is different because different people have different views of Bitcoin, different people have different philosophies, different people have different use cases, different people have different bandwidth restraints, different people are using different devices that they are running their nodes on, different people are using different clients and different implementations. All right, so you decide for yourself what policies you want. But having said that, in an ideal situation, it is always healthy for a decentralized network where multiple participants can communicate with each other having similar policies. So this is one of the reasons that protocol engineers who design softwares in Bitcoin give a lot of weightage to the policies of the miners to ensure that the node runners, the non-mining nodes, emulate them, and we have an ecosystem where majority of the nodes have the same policies. So that is what basically he said. All right, that is what he said. And also the thing is, once my block is mined, right, it's basically the miner that mines the block. And currently 63% of the hash rate is controlled by only 2 mining pools. Okay, tragically. And what happens is that if your mempool is drastically different than the mempool of the miner who has mined the block, then what will happen is that when the block is mined and the block is broadcasted to you, all the transactions in that mined block which are not in your mempool, you will have to individually validate those transactions, which is pretty computation intensive. All right. So if you have a mempool that looks similar to the mempool of the miners that are mining the blocks, which currently in the case of Bitcoin are only 2 or 3 pools which often find the blocks, you don't have to validate those transactions which were missing from your mempool again and again. All right. This is what is referred to as compact block relay. We covered compact block relays in Mastering Bitcoin recently, and we've also covered it in the Optech newsletter. So if the mempools of the non-mining nodes and the mempools of the mining nodes look similar, then like the amount of computation that your node has to do in validating transactions that have been mined and validating nodes that have been mined becomes very little. So these are some of the reasons. Having said that, as a member of a free censorship resistant peer-to-peer network, you're absolutely free to choose what mempool policies and node policies and relay policies you want. Let's take one more question, and then 9:10 we'll wind up. This will take quite a lot of time. This will take quite a lot of time. Which one? Okay, we'll take this one. Is there an economic incentive to use P2WSH over P2TR? Okay, we know what's P2WSH, right? It's basically P2 script hash post segwit. Okay, we had a P2SH pre-segwit where you hash the script. You don't use the base script. Initially, we used to use the base script. We covered this entire evolution in detail in the last session when we were talking about Frost. We talked about it for 30 minutes, how we first had bare multi-sig scripts, and then we turned them into hashed multi-sig scripts, and then we turned them into scriptless multi-signatures, and how we went from threshold to non-threshold, and then we talked about music, and then we talked about Frost, and also like you can go and listen to that. What is P2WSH? It's a pay to witness script hash. It's basically you're paying to the hash of the redeem script. Okay, and this is a SegWit compliant transaction where the witness data is stripped off the transaction. What's P2TR? It's pay to taproot. Okay, so basically, if you have a multi-sig transaction, if 2 or 3 people are coming together to sign a transaction, if it's a 2 of 3 transaction, or if it's a 3 or 5 transaction, you can either use P2WSH, right, which allows you to use scripts to make multi-sig transactions, or you can use P2TR, which makes scriptless aggregated digital signatures possible using music and now using Frost. So in which situation should you use which one? When should you use P2WSH for multi-sig transactions? When should you use P2TR? So there are a few situations, okay, which I mentioned. The first situation could be TapScript only contains a single script, all right? So if there's no point using a taproot transaction if you have only one script, right? If you have only one condition. Basically, why do we use TapScripts? If you have too many conditions, right? If you have a transaction and if you have too many conditions, if this happens, spend it using path A. If that happens, spend it using path B. If this happens, spend it using path C. If this happens, spend it using path D. If you have so many paths, then in that situation, like your redeem script is going to be very big. So when you have to spend your P2WSH transaction, you have to furnish a redeem script, which is going to be mammoth. If you have like lots and lots of conditions, if you have hundreds of conditions, your redeem script is going to be mammoth, and spending that transaction is going to take a lot of fee. So in that situation, you better use P2TR, because P2TR gives you this Merkle root. Each leaf in that Merkle tree is a script, okay, and you have 128 layers, so you can have 2 to the power 128 scripts in that Merkle tree. Okay, so hundreds and thousands of scripts can be incorporated. So if you have lots and lots of scripts, it makes sense for you to use a P2TR transaction. But for example, if you have only one script, you have only one condition, then it makes absolutely no sense or very little sense for you to use P2TR. So this is one situation. If you are using, if you want to spend a transaction which is multi-sig, but there is only one condition which can unlock that transaction, then it's better for you to use P2WSH and not P2TR, because that is more cost and that is more cost efficient. Script itself cannot be divided into multiple leaves, all right? So let's say even if you have multiple conditions, but the conditions are such that they're nested and they cannot be split, right? So in P2TR, if you have multiple conditions, each condition can be split into its own script, and that one script becomes one leaf. Okay, but if you have a script which is nested, for instance, if you have conditional statements which are nested, for instance, they cannot be split, right? The nested conditions cannot be split. So even if you have 3 conditions or 4 conditions or 5 conditions and they are nested, you cannot split them. One condition cannot be independent of the other condition. So in this situation, instead of using P2TR, it is more advisable to use P2WSH. The third situation could be script requires less than 5 signatures. Script requires less than 5 signatures. So if your script requires only 5 signatures or less than 5 signatures, then your redeem script is going to be very small, right? You don't need lots and lots of signatures. When you need lots and lots of signatures, then in that situation, it is preferable to use P2TR, because P2TR deploys no signatures, which are like lesser in size as compared to P2WSH, which deploys ECDSA signatures, which are which like take up more size, right? And that's why you have to pay more, because your signature operations, you have to pay for them. So if you have few signatures, then P2WSH is advisable. But if you have more signatures, then go for P2TR, because P2TR uses no signatures and P2WS uses ECDSA signatures. No motivation to spend in P2TR key path. All right. So if you don't want to spend Comparison, there would be an economic. If you have no motivation to spend in P2T or key path, so you can spend a taproot transaction either using a key path or using a script path. If you have no motivation of spending it using the key path, because in key path you can aggregate signatures, right? If three people are signing, you can aggregate that signature, and that three signatures become one signature, right? So you have to pay less fee. But in like in P2WSH, you cannot aggregate your signatures. You'll have three different public keys on the blockchain. You'll have three different digital signatures on the blockchain, and you have to pay for all of that. So if you have no intention of using aggregated signatures, then P2SH might be a better option for you. So these could be the four situations where you want to spend a transaction that is a multi-sig transaction. This could be the four situations where you would prefer P2WSH over P2TR. One is when the tap script only contains single script. Second is script itself cannot be divided into multiple leaves. Third is script requires less than 5 signatures. The fourth is no motivation to spend in P2TR key path. I think that is all that we have to cover for the session. We're already at 9:15. We'll not delay it any further. If any of you go through the remaining of the Optech later on your own, if you'll have any questions, then please feel free to send those questions to me either via DM or you can post it on the Discord server, and whoever is available will help you, but we'll not be able to cover the entire letter. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and if anybody has any questions, then they can ask the questions for the next 2, 3, 5 minutes. Okay, there are some messages, unread messages. Now it's back to 4 sats per virtual by gotta go. Thanks, Faisal. Thanks for joining, Aaron. Still didn't get the joke. Okay, I'll try and explain again. Asked by Faisal. Who got the joke? Thumbs up. You got the joke now, Drivil? Or you still didn't get the joke?
Yeah. I think what the joke was in the Bitcoin core, we can't put this transaction because, as you explained, the absolute fee should be always higher. So is that the joke? The second transaction
Yes.
has a lower absolute fee?
Right. So yeah, if you're using Bitcoin Core and the person gives birth to a child and they broadcast a transaction and they put an operator on, hey, I have a child, and RBF is not signaled. Okay, RBF is not signaled for the first transaction, then they cannot send the they cannot replace the second transaction. But if you're using Libra Relay, then RBF is on by default. Then if you send a first transaction and then the doctor comes and tells you that, hey, you've got a second child, you can replace the first transaction with the second transaction.
Okay. Got it. But I think in the Bitcoin network itself, most of the miners are using full RBF, right? So
Yes, most miners are using full RBF by default, but most users are not. So
got
the
it.
users have to relay those transactions for them to reach the miner, right? You do not send that transaction directly to the miner. It's not that you directly send it to the miner, right? Your node broadcasts it, then your node will broadcast it, and the other nodes on the network will hear it and they'll propagate it, and they'll keep on gossiping till it eventually reaches the miner. Okay, so you don't directly send it to the miner, you just broadcast it, and all the nodes further broadcast it, and they keep on broadcasting it till it eventually reaches the miner. Okay, so if the nodes do not broadcast it in the first place, if I send transaction A, which cannot be replaced, okay, then I send transaction B. If majority of the nodes do not support RBF by default, majority of the nodes will not replace the conflicting transaction, the second child's transaction, and then it will never reach the miner.
Got it.
All right. Yeah, you saw that in the previous Optech newsletter and asked about it. Oh, okay. Yeah. This question. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you everyone for showing up. And if no further questions, then we can end the session. Good night.